If someone had told me 10 years ago that my friendship with Caleb would end not with a bang, but with the quiet, desperate sound of his fist against my apartment door in the middle of a Tuesday night, I would have believed them. I always knew it had an expiration date. I just never imagined it would be the beginning of something else entirely. For a decade, my life was a carefully curated library of quiet routines. I was Leo, the archivist. I dealt in paper and dust in stories that were already over. My apartment was my sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built from bookshelves and silence. The world outside was loud, chaotic, and largely irrelevant to the meticulously ordered peace I had constructed within my four walls. Caleb was the one piece of chaos I allowed in my life, albeit at a carefully managed distance. We had been friends since college, a classic case of opposites attracting. He was the sun, a blazing star of easy confidence and booming laughter. I was a quiet planet in a far-flung orbit, content to watch his light from a safe distance, warmed by a friendship I knew I was lucky to have. He was a builder, a man who shaped the world with his hands. His palms were calloused, his forearms were a roadmap of faint scars and sun-darkened skin. He built houses, extensions, lives. He had built one with Sarah. I'd attended their wedding. I stood in the back, a ghost in a rented suit, and watched him promise his forever to someone else. My heart felt like a stone in my chest, a cold, heavy thing. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I raised my glass when I was supposed to raise my glass, and I perfected the art of being his best friend, the platonic, supportive, safe one. It was a role I played for years. The barrier between us was clear, defined. He was the happily married man. I was the confirmed bachelor, the friend he'd call for a beer when Sarah was out with her friends. The distance was a chasm I had dug myself, a moat around my own fragile heart. I loved him. It was a simple, terrible, and unchangeable fact of my existence, a secret I intended to carry to my grave. Then came the sound, not a polite knock, a frantic, muffled thudding. The kind of sound that rips through the carefully constructed silence of a Tuesday night and frays the edges of your nerves. I was in my reading chair, a book lying open on my lap, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. My cat Apollo lifted his head from the armrest, his ears swiveling toward the door. Thud, 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 my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. No one came to my door this late. No one ever came to my door without texting first. My world was ordered, this was disorder, this was chaos. I placed the book on the side table, my movements stiff, robotic. I walked to the door, my bare feet cold against the polished hardwood. I peered through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. Caleb, but not the Caleb I knew, not the sun. The man in my hallway was a storm cloud, a tempest hunched in on himself. His broad shoulders were slumped. His head was bowed, his usually proud profile obscured by a curtain of damp hair plastered to his forehead by the rain I hadn't even noticed was falling. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. The deadbolt slid back with a loud, metallic clank that seemed to echo the frantic beating of my own heart. I pulled the door inward. He didn't look up at first. He just stood there dripping onto my welcome mat, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. The smell of rain and something else, something acrid like despair, wafted in with him. "Caleb," my voice was a croak. He finally lifted his head, and the sight of his face was a physical blow. The easy confidence was gone, stripped away. His eyes, usually a warm, clear blue, were red-rimmed and hollow, swimming in a pain so profound it seemed to suck all the air out of the hallway. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching violently beneath the skin. He was trembling, a man built of solid oak and steel, and he was trembling like a leaf. "Leo," he whispered, and his voice broke on my name. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, of a whole world falling apart. He took a staggering step forward, crossing the threshold from his world into mine. And just like that, the barrier I had so carefully maintained for a decade was gone. My fortress had been breached. The chaos was inside. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The wreckage of his marriage was written all over him. He just stood in my entryway, a shipwreck of a man, and looked at me with an expression of such raw, desperate need that it shattered something deep inside me. "It's over," he managed to choke out, the words mangled by a sob he was trying and failing to suppress. It's over. My carefully ordered life, my quiet, predictable solitude ended in that moment. He had come to my door. He had brought his storm into my sanctuary, and all I could do was let him in. I stepped back, holding the door wider, and he stumbled inside, bringing the cold and the rain and the end of his world with him. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing us in together. He stayed on the couch. That first night, he just collapsed onto it, fully clothed and still damp, and fell into a fractured, twitching sleep. I covered him with a quilt, the one my grandmother had made, a patchwork of faded colors and soft, worn cotton. I watched him for a long time, the moonlight from the window striping his exhausted face. The invincible man was gone. In his place was just a man, broken, lost. The next morning, my routine was obliterated. My quiet cup of coffee, my silent perusal of the news, it was all replaced by the heavy presence of another person in my space. He was a mountain in the middle of my living room, a disruption of every line and angle I had grown so accustomed to. He sat at my small kitchen table, a place usually set for one, and stared into a mug of coffee I'd made for him. He hadn't touched it, it was going cold. This was the beginning of the forced proximity, the element I had always secretly craved and openly feared. He was here, not for a beer, not for a few hours. He was living here in my space. In my life, the days that followed blurred into a new, uncomfortable rhythm. I would go to work at the university archive, spending my hours in the hushed, reverent silence of history. But the silence was different now. It was no longer peaceful, it was just empty. I was aware every moment of the man waiting in my apartment. I found myself checking my phone constantly, a nervous tick I'd never had before. A part of me expected a text saying he'd left, that he'd found somewhere else to go. A part of me dreaded it. When I came home, he would be there. Sometimes on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. Sometimes pacing the length of my living room, a caged animal in a space too small for his energy, too quiet for his grief. We barely spoke. The air was thick with everything unsaid. I'd ask if he'd eaten. He'd mumble a yes or a no. I'd make food and we'd eat in a silence that felt heavier than stone. But in that silence I started to see him, really see him. Before I had seen Caleb from a distance, an idealized version painted by my own longing. The confident friend, the handsome husband, the man who had everything. Now up close, the masterpiece was cracked and I could see the canvas underneath. I noticed the fine silver threads appearing at his temples, stark against his dark hair. I saw the way his calloused hands I'd always seen as symbols of his strength, now seemed to tremble when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes, a permanent weariness that even sleep couldn't erase. One afternoon, I came home early and found him sitting on the floor, his back against the couch, a shoebox of old photos spilled around him. Pictures of him and Sarah, smiling on a beach, laughing at their wedding. He wasn't crying. He was just looking at them with a numb, vacant expression. He was trying to figure out where it went wrong, trying to pinpoint the moment the foundation had cracked. He saw me standing in the doorway and flinched, quickly trying to gather the photos as if he'd been caught doing something shameful. "Sorry," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Just sorting." "You don't have to apologize," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "It's your life, Caleb." He looked up at me then, and in his eyes I saw a flicker of something new. Not just pain, but vulnerability. A silent plea for, what? Understanding, absolution, I didn't know. But for the first time, he wasn't just a guest in my home. He was a man asking for help, and I was the only one there to give it. The power dynamic, the one where he was the sun and I was the satellite, began to shift. The first touch happened on a Friday night, a week after he'd arrived. A storm was raging outside, a mirror of the one inside him. The wind howled, rattling the old windows of my apartment building. I was making tea, a pointless gesture of comfort, but the only one I knew how to make. The kettle whistled, a shrill, piercing sound. I poured the boiling water into 2 mugs, the steam fogging my glasses. Caleb was standing by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. He looked so lost, so utterly alone, a silhouette against the violent night. "Here," I said, walking over to him. I held out a mug. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He reached for the mug, his large hand moving to close around it, and his fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't a lingering touch. It was fleeting, accidental, lasting no more than a second. But for me, it was a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where my heart stuttered and seized. Heat bloomed on my skin, a searing brand where his skin had met mine. My breath hitched, I'm sure I flinched. My carefully constructed composure, the mask of the platonic friend, cracked. Panic, raw, undiluted panic. My mind screamed at me. He felt that. He knows everything. But Caleb didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he gave no sign. He just took the mug, his fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. "Thanks, Leo," he mumbled, his gaze returning to the storm outside. I retreated to the kitchen, my back to him, my own hand trembling. I leaned against the counter, pressing my forehead against the cool surface of a cabinet. My heart was a wild thing, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was just a touch, a meaningless, accidental touch, but it had undone me. It had reminded me, with brutal clarity, of the truth I had spent a decade trying to bury. This proximity was a form of torture. It was a constant, low-grade hum of longing that was slowly driving me insane. Having him here, so close and yet so impossibly far, was worse than the years of distance. The chasm was still there, but now I was standing right at the edge of it every single day. A few nights later, the shift became an earthquake. I was woken up by a sound, a choked, gasping noise from the living room. I lay in my bed, my heart instantly pounding. My first thought was that he was hurt. I slid out of bed and crept to my bedroom door, cracking it open just enough to see. The living room was dark, save for the pale, ghostly light of the city filtering through the windows. Caleb was sitting up on the couch, his head in his hands, his broad back shaking with silent, racking sobs. But then the sound came again, sharper this time, a desperate, ragged gasp for air. He wasn't just crying, he couldn't breathe, panic attack. I recognized it instantly. I'd had enough of my own to know the shape of that particular monster. All thought, all fear for myself vanished. I didn't hesitate. I crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt in front of him on the floor. "Caleb, hey, look at me." He didn't respond. His knuckles were white where he gripped his own hair, his whole body rigid with tension. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, useless puffs. "Caleb," I said again, my voice firm but calm. I placed my hand on his knee. Another jolt, but this time I ignored it. I had to. "You're okay. You're having a panic attack. You need to breathe with me. Can you do that?" He shook his head, a violent, jerky motion. A raw, animal sound of fear tore from his throat. He was drowning, and I, the quiet, anxious man who spent his life avoiding emotional currents, had to be his lifeguard. The old dynamic was not just shifted, it was completely inverted. He, the strong one, was helpless. I, the weak one, had to be his anchor. "Okay," I said softly. "Okay, just listen to my voice. I'm right here, you're in my apartment, you're safe." I moved my hand from his knee to his back, rubbing slow, firm circles between his shoulder blades. The muscles there were like iron cables. "Breathe in, Caleb, through your nose, 1, 2, 3, 4. He tried, but his inhale was a shuddering, broken thing. "Good, now out, through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, me kneeling on the floor in the dark, my hand on his back, coaching his breath, him slowly, painfully coming back from the brink. The shudders subsided, his breathing gradually deepened, evening out. The tension in his shoulders began to release under my palm. Finally, he lifted his head from his hands. His face was pale, slick with sweat and tears. He looked utterly wrecked. "And ashamed, Leo," he rasped, his voice raw. I'm sorry, I don't know what." "Don't," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Don't apologize." "It's okay." He just stared at me, his blue eyes wide and lost in the gloom. The invincible facade was completely gone. In its place was a vulnerability so profound it was like looking into an open wound. He wasn't just my friend anymore. He wasn't just the man I loved from afar. He was a person I was caring for, a soul I was tending to. And then he did something that stopped my heart. He leaned forward not by much, but enough. He rested his forehead against my shoulder. The contact was electric, 1,000 times more potent than the brush of our fingers. I could feel the dampness of his hair against my t-shirt, the warmth of his skin, the faint, shuddering breaths he was still taking. He wasn't reaching for me romantically. He was just reaching for an anchor in the storm, for solid ground. And for some reason in that moment I was it. My own fear, my own decade of longing seemed to quiet. It was replaced by a powerful, overwhelming urge to just hold him, to protect him. I slowly lifted my other hand and rested it on his shoulder, completing the embrace. We stayed like that in the dark, in the quiet of my living room. Me, holding the broken pieces of the man I loved, feeling the weight of him against me. The chasm between us hadn't vanished, but for the first time, it felt like we were on the same side of it. The turning point came a week later. The air in the apartment had changed after that night. The heavy, oppressive silence was replaced by a tentative softness. We started talking more. Not about the big things, not about Sarah or the divorce, but about small things. Books I was reading. A difficult project he was quoting for work. We found a new, fragile language. It was a Saturday. Rain again. It seemed to be the backdrop to every significant moment of this new chapter. We had ordered takeout, a rare indulgence, and opened a bottle of whiskey Caleb had bought as a thank you. We were in the living room, sitting on the floor with our backs against the couch, plates of Thai food balanced on our laps. The only light came from my reading lamp, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. It felt intensely private, a small bubble of warmth against the cold, wet world outside. The whiskey was doing its work, loosening the tightly coiled knots of tension and propriety. Caleb had been quiet for a while, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I don't think I ever said thank you for everything." "You don't have to," I said, taking a sip of my own whiskey. The burn was pleasant. "That's what friends are for." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, friends." He looked at me, his gaze direct and searching. "You're a better friend to me than I've ever been to you, Leo." My heart did a slow, painful lurch. "That's not true." "It is," he insisted. He set his glass down on the floor with a soft thud. "I've spent the last 10 years being loud and selfish and completely oblivious. I took you for granted. I just assumed you'd always be there in the background, my quiet, dependable friend Leo." Every word was a small, sharp pinprick against my skin. He wasn't wrong, but hearing him say it aloud was still painful. "I never minded," I lied. He shook his head, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "Yes, you did. You're just too damn polite to say so." He paused, his gaze dropping to my hands, which were resting on my knees. "Why have you always been so careful around me?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. This was it. The moment I had rehearsed and dreaded in my mind 1,000 times, the point of no return. The whiskey in my veins gave me a foolish, reckless courage. The decade of silence felt like a pressure about to burst. My mouth was dry. I took a breath. "Caleb, just tell me the truth, Leo," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. For once, no more being careful. I looked at him, at the man I had loved for a third of my life, the man who was broken and lost and seeking honesty in the wreckage of his life. He deserved it. And maybe, after all this time, so did I because, I said, my voice barely a whisper, the words feeling alien and terrifying on my tongue, because I've been in love with you since we were 20. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The sound of the rain against the window seemed to fade away. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't look at him. I stared at the wood grain of the floor, my vision blurring. This is it. The end. I've ruined everything. He's going to get up, pack his bag, and walk out of my life forever. The friendship I cherished, the one thing I had of him, I had just incinerated it with a single, selfish confession. Regret, sharp and sickening, flooded me. I braced myself for the sound of him moving, for the cold, polite dismissal, for the anger. But it didn't come. Instead, after what felt like a lifetime, I heard him release a long, slow breath, a shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Leo," he said, his voice thick. I finally forced myself to look up. He hadn't moved. He was still sitting there looking at me, but his expression, it wasn't disgust. It wasn't anger or pity. It was something I couldn't decipher. It was shock, yes, but there was something else underneath, a dawning realization. A profound, soul-shaking surprise. He slowly reached out, his hand moving through the space between us. He didn't touch my face or my shoulder. He gently, tentatively laid his hand over mine, where it was still clenched on my knee. His calloused palm was warm, his touch firm. It wasn't accidental this time. It was deliberate. It was a question. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact, the rough texture of his skin against mine, the weight of his hand. My heart was no longer frantic. It was just full, aching. "Oh," he breathed out, the words small and full of wonder. He looked from our joined hands to my face, his blue eyes searching mine. "Oh, Leo," he started to lean in. It was impossibly slow. Every millimeter of movement was a choice, a question. My mind was screaming, "This is happening. This can't be happening." I was frozen, caught between a decade of disciplined denial and the unbelievable reality of the present moment. His face was so close now. I could see the flecks of gray in his irises, the faint scar above his eyebrow I'd only ever noticed from a distance. He smelled of whiskey and rain and something that was just fundamentally Caleb. His gaze dropped to my lips, my own breath hitched. He paused an inch away, his eyes lifting back to mine, asking for permission. I didn't know how to give it. I didn't know how to do any of this, so I just met him halfway. I closed the final, terrifying inch between us. His lips were soft, softer than I ever could have imagined. The kiss wasn't passionate or frantic, it was hesitant, it was questioning, it was a discovery. It was the taste of whiskey and salt from tears I hadn't realized he was shedding. It was the gentle, searching pressure of his mouth against mine. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. In that kiss was a decade of unspoken longing from me and a decade of unexamined confusion from him. It was a confession and an answer all at once. It was everything. He pulled back slowly, his hand still covering mine. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "I am so stupid," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I've been so stupid." I didn't know what he meant. I couldn't form a thought. I was just drowning in the sensation of it, the aftershock of a moment I had never, ever believed would come. He kissed me again, deeper this time, more certain. And I kissed him back, pouring every ounce of the love I had kept hidden for so long into the simple, miraculous press of our lips. The fortress was in ruins. The chasm was gone. We were no longer on opposite sides. We were in the same place finally at the same time. I woke to the gray light of dawn filtering into my bedroom, not the couch. For a blissful, disoriented second, I just felt warm, safe. The scent of him was on my pillows, on my skin. The memory of the night before was a warm, glowing ember in my chest. The hesitant kisses that had turned into something more. The fumbling, earnest exploration in the dark. The eventual migration from the living room floor to my bed, where we had fallen asleep tangled together, his arm thrown protectively over my waist. Then reality crashed in. The space beside me was empty, the warmth turned to ice. I sat bolt upright, my heart instantly seizing with a familiar, sickening dread. The sheets were cold where he should have been. I listened. The apartment was silent, too silent. The comfortable, lived-in silence of two people sleeping had been replaced by the hollow, empty silence of one person alone. My stomach filled with a swarm of angry bees. Anxiety, sharp and cold, clawed its way up my throat. He's gone. The thought was a physical blow. I threw back the covers, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. I grabbed my discarded t-shirt from the floor and pulled it on, my movements jerky with rising panic. I walked into the living room. It was empty. The whiskey glasses were still on the floor, a damning piece of evidence. The couch, where he had slept for weeks, was neat, the quilt folded precisely at one end. His duffel bag was gone from the corner where it had been a permanent fixture. His jacket was gone from the hook by the door. His boots were gone from the mat. He had left. He had woken up in the clear, sober light of morning, realized what he had done, and he had fled. The ember of joy in my chest was extinguished, replaced by a black hole of self-loathing. My mind began its vicious spiral, a well-worn path of self-recrimination. I took advantage of him. He was vulnerable, grieving, drunk. And I let him, I encouraged him, I pushed him. He was disgusted. He was just being kind last night, trying not to hurt the pathetic, pining friend who finally confessed. And the moment he could, he ran. I've ruined everything. Not just the friendship. I've made myself into something predatory, something shameful in his eyes. He will never speak to me again. The pain was so intense it was physical. I wrapped my arms around my stomach, doubling over as if I'd been punched. The beautiful, miraculous night was now tainted, twisted into something ugly and sordid in my mind. The memory of his lips on mine now burned with shame. I stumbled to the kitchen and stared at my phone lying on the counter. No messages, no missed calls, just a blank, dark screen that reflected my own miserable face. The silence of the apartment was no longer just empty. It was accusatory. Every corner of the room seemed to scream his absence. The indent on the couch cushion, the mug he'd used still in the drying rack, the very air itself, it was all haunted by him. My sanctuary had become a prison cell, the walls closing in on me. My former solitude, the one I had cultivated and cherished, returned, but it was different now. It was spoiled. Before, it had been a state of peace. Now it was a state of lack. It was defined not by its own quiet completeness, but by the gaping, agonizing absence of him. I spent the day in a fugue state. I didn't shower, I didn't eat. I just drifted through the rooms of my apartment like a ghost, touching the places he had been. The back of the couch, the window he'd stared out of, the pillow next to mine. I replayed every moment of the night before, dissecting it, searching for the sign I had missed. The hesitation in his kiss that I had misinterpreted as wonder, the confusion in his eyes that I had mistaken for revelation. "I am so stupid," he had said. He hadn't meant he was stupid for not realizing his feelings for me. He meant he was stupid for letting this happen, for getting drunk and confused and crossing a line. It was so obvious. How could I have been so blind? The hours crawled by, each one a fresh wave of misery. The sun arced across the sky and began to set, painting the room in hues of orange and purple that felt like a mockery. I curled up on the couch, pulling the quilt he had used over me, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of him that clung to the fabric. It was a form of self-torture. I was pathetic, a walking, breathing cliché of unrequited love and regret. I finally checked my phone again, my thumb hovering over his contact. Should I text him? An apology? "I'm so sorry about last night, let's just forget it happened." But the words felt like ash in my mouth. How could I forget it? It was the most real thing that had ever happened to me. No, the silence was his answer. I had to accept it. I had pushed and he had pulled away. The cycle was complete. Our friendship was the price for one night of impossible intimacy. Darkness fell. The city lights began to twinkle outside my window. I didn't bother turning on a lamp. I just lay there in the dark, letting the despair wash over me. And then I heard a sound. A key turning in the lock of my front door. My blood ran cold. My heart stopped. I had given him a key weeks ago for emergencies. I never thought he would use it. My mind leaped to the worst conclusion. He was just coming back to drop it on the table, a final, definitive severing of ties. The door swung open. Caleb stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the bright light of the hallway. He was holding a brown paper bag of what looked like groceries. He closed the door softly behind him, plunging the room back into near darkness. He just stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was a statue of pure dread on the couch. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet, tentative. He saw me then, a lump under the quilt. He took a hesitant step into the room, then another. He put the grocery bag down on the kitchen counter. He looked wrecked, just as wrecked as I felt. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. He walked over to the couch and stood looking down at me. I couldn't read his expression in the gloom. I just braced myself for the final blow. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. God, Leo, I am so sorry. The apology was a knife in my gut. It's okay, I whispered, my voice hoarse from disuse. You don't have to, I understand. No, he said, shaking his head. No, you don't, you can't. He crouched down in front of me, bringing himself to my level. Now I could see his face, his eyes. They were filled not with disgust, but with a desperate, frantic regret. I'm sorry I ran. I'm not sorry about last night. I'm sorry I ran this morning. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. They didn't fit the narrative I had spent all day constructing. I woke up, he continued, his voice low and urgent, and you were there, sleeping, and it was, everything, it was too much, it was too good. And it terrified me. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a second before he rested it on my knee, his touch a branding iron of reassurance. My whole life, Leo, everything has been loud and clear. Build this, love her. Do this, a straight line, and last night, you blew that all up. And it was the most terrifying and the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to me. I woke up this morning and I didn't know who I was anymore, and I panicked. I'm a coward, I ran. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. I spent the entire day walking, just walking the city, trying to make sense of it. Trying to find the old me, the one who would be disgusted or confused. But he's gone. All I could think about was you. All I could think about was the look on your face when I left. I imagined you here thinking the worst. And it was killing me. The tightly coiled spring of anxiety in my chest began to unwind, slowly, painfully. Hope, a fragile, tentative thing, began to bloom in the wasteland of my despair. I thought you were disgusted, I whispered, the words tasting of shame. I thought I'd ruined everything. Ruined, he let out a choked laugh, a sound halfway between a sob and a revelation. Leo, you didn't ruin anything. You're the only thing that makes sense, I think. I think maybe I've been in love with you for years and I was just too stupid and too scared to see it. You were my best friend, it wasn't supposed to be this, but it is. It is, this was it, the clarifying conversation, the raw, terrifying honesty that comes after the fall. I'm scared, Caleb, I admitted, my voice trembling. I know, he said, his thumb stroking my knee. I'm terrified. I don't know how to do this, but I know I don't want to do it without you. I don't want to go back to the way things were. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out, my spare key. He held it in his palm, the metal glinting in the dim light. He didn't hand it back to me. Instead, he took my hand, uncurled my stiff fingers, and pressed the key firmly into my palm, closing my own fingers around it. I don't want this to be your spare key anymore, he said, his voice thick with meaning. I don't want to be a guest on your couch. I want to come home, to you, if you'll have me. The symbolic gesture, the tangible act of commitment. It wasn't a diamond ring or a public proclamation. It was a small, worn piece of brass, but it was everything. It was a key to a future I had never dared to imagine. Tears I had held back all day finally fell, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of relief, of a decade of tension finally releasing. I didn't say anything. I just tightened my grip on the key and launched myself off the couch into his arms. He caught me, his strong arms wrapping around me, holding me tight against his chest. I buried my face in the crook of his neck, inhaling his scent, feeling the solid, real, spectacular truth of him. He was here. He came back. He wasn't running away. He was running home. The new beginning wasn't a grand, cinematic event. It was quiet. It was domestic. It was a series of small, mundane moments that were more profound than any dramatic declaration. The next morning, I didn't wake up alone. I woke up to the feeling of his arm around my waist, his slow, steady breathing against the back of my neck. I lay there for a long time, not moving, just soaking in the simple, radical peace of it. The anxiety was gone. In its place was a quiet, solid certainty. He stirred, his grip on me tightening. Morning, he mumbled into my hair, his voice rough with sleep. Morning, I replied, my voice soft. There was no awkwardness. No doubt, just a shared, comfortable silence. Later, we stood in my small kitchen, a space that now felt perfectly sized for two. I was making coffee, the familiar ritual now a shared one. He was leaning against the counter, watching me with a small, sleepy smile on his face. He was wearing one of my old t-shirts. It was too small for him, stretching tight across his broad shoulders. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The brown paper bag he'd brought was on the counter. I peered inside. Milk, eggs, bread, coffee beans, the basics, the building blocks of a life. He hadn't just come back, he had come back to stay. That afternoon, we cleared a space in my closet. My neatly ordered rows of shirts and sweaters were joined by his flannel, his jeans, his worn work clothes. The sight of his things next to mine, a jumble of two different lives merging into one, sent a thrill of pure joy through me. His duffel bag, once a symbol of his transient presence, was now empty and stored away. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, talking and laughing. The heavy silence that had once filled the apartment was gone, replaced by the easy cadence of conversation. We talked about everything and nothing. The future, the past, the ridiculous plot of a movie we both loved. That night when we went to bed, there was no hesitation, no fear, just a simple, profound rightness. We lay facing each other in the dark, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling. "You know," I said, tracing the line of his jaw with my finger, "my life was so quiet before you came crashing back into it." He caught my hand and brought it to his lips, kissing my knuckles. "Was that a bad thing?" "I thought it was a good thing," I admitted. "I thought my routine was my sanctuary. I built all these walls to keep the chaos out." "And I'm the chaos," he said, a note of his old teasing humor in his voice. "You're the chaos," I agreed, smiling in the dark. "You came in and knocked down all my walls, you wrecked the place." He grew serious, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I'm sorry, Leo. For all the years I was so blind." "Don't be," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "If things had been different, maybe we wouldn't be here right now." I thought about my old life, the solitude. The carefully managed loneliness I had mistaken for peace. The silent, aching love for a man I thought I could never have. It felt like a story about someone else, a book I had read a long time ago. Caleb was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the disruption that didn't break my life, but broke it open. He had come to my door looking for a safe harbor from his own storm, and in doing so, he had rescued me from the stagnant calm of my own making. He was right, I hadn't ruined anything. I had just finally told the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was not an ending. It was a foundation, and on it together we were finally starting to build.